In 1904, a psychiatrist in Zurich read a list of words out loud to his patients one at a time. For most words, nothing happened, but every so often a single word would trigger a pause of maybe 5, 10, or 20 seconds, and a visible spike on a machine reading the electrical activity of the patient's skin. That psychiatrist was Carl Jung, and the spike that was observed pointed to something simple and profound. These experiments helped Jung prove his hypothesis around complexes, but I think they also contribute to our understanding that complexes are not simply mental phenomenon, but physiological phenomenon. This also connects to the ideas that individuals are influenced by energy in their bodies, that psychological processes can be understood as energetic processes. Whether we take this as literal or metaphorical doesn't change the utility or power of this concept as it's applied clinically. And in this video, I'm going to discuss something that doesn't seem to get enough conversation in contemporary psychotherapeutic approaches. I don't know why that is. You'll see, though, that this concept of psychic energy actually transcends individual psychotherapy modalities and also actually helps us really understand what therapy is from the context of a depth psychological orientation and what it means to grow, what it means to heal, what it means to change, what it means to work. This is really significant because we understand this principle, we can understand what really we're doing in therapy, what it is, what to expect. We can understand how to relate to these processes inside of us. So we need to understand that if we're talking about energy, we're talking about something with force and motion. We can go back to Freud with this because the language of psychic energy didn't start as some kind of poetic or mythological process. Freud actually trained under a physiologist named Ernst Bruck, who belonged to a group of scientists in Berlin who had taken a hard stance. Only physical and chemical forces operate inside living organisms. No vital spark, no separate life force, just physics all the way down. And while I might not agree with that, per se, as I'll get to later, that's the world that Freud came up through. This theory greatly influenced his theory of psychology. Freud's psychodynamics were quite literally based on concepts from thermodynamics. Repression, discharge, cathexis, drive. These all imply directional force. And Freud was using the language that he had at that time, attempting to draw connections between physiological, psychological, and really physics. So he used this language when he developed his theory of psychoanalysis, which became known as psychodynamics, really drawing from thermodynamics. I've linked a paper on this, by the way. You can check it out in the description. So why this is relevant for us is not so much to prove that psychic energy is measurable in some kind of quantifiable sense. I'm not really that interested in that, and I don't think that's the most useful approach. I'm a pragmatist at the end of the day, being a clinician. So I think there's a place to try to measure these things, but that's not really the main point of this video. These concepts suggest a whole epistemology, theory of knowledge about what psychological processes are and how they're related to an economy of energy in the psyche. These ideas also suggest an etiology or cause of psychopathology, which became synonymous with the psychodynamic process of psychotherapy. And these ideas are retained in many ways by Jungian analytical psychology, although we can say that the understanding of pathology, I think, is articulated differently. Jung's model is teleological, whereas Freud's is more ideological, more about the history, the past of an individual. The concept of psychic energy, its directionality, while it may be interpreted differently by these schools, is really foundational. And so much of that is really based on this concept from physics known as the conservation of force. Also could be called the conservation of energy. This, which can be illustrated through the Freudian concept of repression. Repression is, in psychodynamic thought, considered to be a defense mechanism. A defense is something that operates to manage a threatening impulse, sometimes by keeping it out of consciousness, as in repression or dissociation, and sometimes by changing how it gets expressed while you may be aware of it. Repression, specifically, is an unconscious defense wherein an individual pushes away some thought, emotion, affect, memory from their conscious mind. Remember, this pushing doesn't happen consciously, though. In the context of the conservation of energy, what this pulls on is that such energy is not destroyed through repression, meaning that because someone unconsciously keeps a psychological reality, whether that be thought, feeling, belief, some reality out of their conscious mind, does not mean that that reality does not exist. It means that it has to take up space somewhere to be expressed somehow. And this is really characteristic of Freud's concept of the return of the repressed, that the repressed, whatever it might be, has a psychical, energetic quality that must be expressed somehow. It does not disappear into thin air. If we take this also with the idea of suppression, so repression implies that there is an unconscious blocking, meaning we're not volitionally doing the repression. Suppression implies more volition, more willful choosing. I don't want to feel that. I'm aware that some feeling is starting to move into my conscious mind, and I say, I don't want to feel that. I want to push it down. Maybe there's a superego component. I shouldn't feel that. Maybe it's just a discomfort. And so I distract myself, or I actually intentionally push that feeling out of my consciousness. That would be suppression. The principle of the conservation of energy is the same, though, meaning suppression doesn't lead to the absence of what's suppressed. It leads to an alternative expression or an unconscious expression of what is suppressed. When we have to utilize a defensive process, now there are many other defenses. I'm just citing the two simplest to illustrate this idea. When we have to apply, or when we apply a defensive strategy to keep material out of our conscious minds, this necessitates an alternative expression of that material, which, in a psychodynamic sense, leads us to the symptom. Meaning that the symptom is the expression, the unconscious expression of that psychic energy which we cannot tolerate in our conscious minds. Whether it's attached to a belief or a thought, or it's a specific emotion, or it's not a specific emotion, but a more non-specific affect. Typically, we would think that all of these are interwoven, or at least that's how I would most generally think of it. And this, another word for this is a complex. Complex being an amalgamation with a kind of center of gravity through which emotions and beliefs about self and other constellate, and it starts to pick up like its own gravitational pull, and that part of us starts to operate independently of our conscious will, and then it bursts through the symptom, really, or as in Jung's experiment, through the change in consciousness of the individual that was measurable in the ways discussed in the introduction to this video. So all of this really is based on this theory of the conservation of energy. I think this is really important, particularly these days, when so many folks, through no ill will or through understandable reasons, people want relief from suffering when they go to something like therapy. The problem that happens, though, within this is that it's more complex than just learning a tool or a skill. Because the defensive aspects of us are survival oriented, meaning they operate non-rationally. They operate below the level of our conscious mind most often. And if we don't have a lens for that, and we think that we can just solve things intellectually by thinking the right thought, I just don't see how there's any way to actually work at the underlying structures, psychological structures, which Yes, we can't see that they exist the way that we see our arms exist, or the way we see an organ exist. That doesn't make them any less existent. So I think all of this is held together by the theory of the conservation of energy. And knowing that is important if we want to go into something like psychotherapy and find usefulness of it. Because I think, okay, listen, now I'm speaking from my own biases about therapy here. I'm not speaking for every school of therapy. But I think if we go to therapy and we think, okay, I'm just going to find a new way to think about something, or we go to AI and we say, hey, AI, can you give me some tools to work with this? You'll get some tools. You'll get some other ways to think about it. The problem there, though, is that most of the processes that are keeping us stuck in place are unconscious. So it's like if we keep throwing a bunch of stuff at ourselves through the conscious mind, but the unconscious is actually, or a complex is actually calling the shots here. How can that work? It might work a little bit, but sustainably, how can that work? I think of it like, you know those games where you have to throw the ball, those kind of like carnival games, you have to throw the ball into the jar, right? We could think of it like that. There's an aperture that we need to throw a ball into. And we could get 100 balls and just throw them. And I know that game's rigged, right? It's a carnival game, so just assume it's rigged. But we could get 100 balls and just throw them and hope for the best. And, maybe a couple go in. Most likely, though, they're all going to bounce off, or most of them are going to bounce off. Alternatively, if we just had a couple of balls, let's say, and instead of just throwing them and hoping for the best, we actually could somehow refine our motion to observe the mechanics of how we throw the ball, to observe what makes a good shot, to study that process. That would take a lot more time. But what we end up is a greater depth of understanding, a more nuanced understanding about the process that's happening, which gives us an opportunity at more mastery of those mechanics. In the first example, we're not even looking at the mechanics. We're just shooting shot after shot. No understanding of the mechanics. In the second example, we are having to study what actually happens when we go through the motion of throwing. What happens when we move our arm this way? Is there a place we get stuck, hung up? What is that? Is there a way for us to reverse engineer to understand that sticking point? Can we just go around it? Do we need to engage it in a way? Do we need to work a different muscle group? It's an imprecise analogy. However, I think it says something about the difference between a depth-oriented approach and one that predominantly works on the surface. You see, the thing about positive thinking or schools of therapy that are only focused on thinking, or even only behavior. Listen, I want to be careful here because there are useful practices and, of course, excellent practitioners in all schools of therapy, in all modalities. However, what I see is that when individuals focus so much on thinking better thoughts or understanding their catastrophic thoughts or their cognitive errors, distortions, whatever you want to call those. If there's no understanding about suppression and psychic energy, what I see is that people use that language to then start suppressing. The superego co-ops the language most often and then generates a suppressing force towards the emotional or the affective state that happens inside, which short term may help someone think they have some control over their reality. But that's flimsy. It's very flimsy because we don't have control. And that's the thing about depth psychology that both Jung and Freud, those traditions really speak to, that complexes operate outside of our conscious will. And if our framework can't hold that, and we think that everything is controllable through some applied method in that way, it's just going to be flimsy. I'm not saying that the tool is bad or we shouldn't have tools. A tool can be a small part of what helps us develop the capacity for reflexive awareness or awareness of our process of awareness, our process of conscious operation. Tools can help with that, quote unquote tools, practices, whatever you want to call it. But just like the analogy of the Carnival Game, if we get a bunch of tools and we just throw them without looking at our mechanics, it's most likely that none of them are going to sink the ball. And if we use any kind of positive thinking as a suppressive force, then we haven't studied our mechanics well enough. We don't have the fundamentals down. And this is just what I see very often, is that these tools, cognitive approaches get co-opted by suppressive and defensive functions in individuals, and they stay stuck. Does that mean it happens in every case? No, absolutely not. Unfortunately, I just don't hear a lot of people talking to this. That's why I'm so adamant about it. This theory also goes well with somatic psychology. And somatic psychology has roots in psychoanalysis. If you didn't know that, by the way, Winnicott talked about psychosoma. Somatic psychology operates really under the same principle of the conservation of force. It's understand in a trauma context through something like the body keeps the score. It means that the nervous system, when faced with trauma, now of course trauma is defined more about how someone relates to or how their bodies relate to an experience rather than the event itself. But if someone's exposed to a traumatic event and their actual nervous systems can't metabolize that psychosomatic energy or the psychic energy because of the threat, so they have to engage a defense mechanism such as dissociation, then that psychic energy gets frozen. And from somatic therapy sense, that means that the psychic energy is expressed not just behaviorally, but also through the body, through felt sense. And, this is consistent with what I spoke with Leslie Ellis about in my one of my recent interviews about nightmares and embodied dream work. Nightmares can get stuck. People with repetitive nightmares from trauma, the nightmare itself can get stuck. It's like we understand trauma as can have a freezing effect and a split off effect. Like when something overwhelms our system, it can get fragmented and split into parts so that we can try to keep some sense of okayness. And this often happens outside of conscious control. And so when that expresses in a dream, it can express like a repeating nightmare. And the principle is the same. And in Dr. Ellis's work, she talks about re-entering the dream and allowing the dream to move forward, or dreaming the dream onward, because the intent there is that stuck place, if we stay stuck, the energy is sort of trapped in it. And if we can allow the dream to dream forward, it's like we're opening up a new pathway, that to start to move. Again, whether the energy is literal or metaphorical doesn't really matter. The principle is the same. And, nightmares can be so intense because they can get caught right at that point where the arousal of the nervous system is at its highest. What we're looking at is how do we start to allow that energy to move, support that energy in moving. And Leslie mentioned this quote from Jung, who is a somatic, really a pioneer in somatic psychology as well, although he may have not used that term. He was the one whose studies ended up in the method of focusing. Jung has a quote saying, "When it is felt, it changes," meaning if we translate that through the lens of which I've been speaking, it's like when something can become conscious and felt, it can move. It can change. When it's not able to be felt, it has to be expressed another way. I often use the analogy of pressure equals force over area. And the force is the psychic energy. The area is the extent that something can be allowed in our conscious minds. And the pressure is related to that inversely. So the more area, the less pressure. The less area a psychic energy can take up in our conscious minds, the more pressure we experience. And the pressure is what leads to exposes the cracks in our psychic system. And it's what exposes the symptom. Same principle behind all of this, the conservation of force. Again, if we just try to change thoughts by replacing them, one for another, but there's sort of a disconnection from the body or the energetic quality of that. It hasn't been felt, and we're just kind of layering new stories on top. I'm not a believer in that approach. I do think that our thoughts can influence our reality and can change our mood or contribute to change in our mood and can change our energy. I think there's a big caveat with that, though. And for most people, I think they're using that approach in a more suppressive manner. This is not something that's new, what I'm talking about. It's not a new theory. I just think it's an underutilized theory. And one that I hope that people exposed to psychology who are looking more of the who have been more exposed to the pop psychology angle might want to consider. One of the last things I want to say here is that while I don't want to say that they're equivalent, this idea of energy in the body is not. It's not also something unique to Western psychology. That this is something that Chinese medicine has known about for thousands of years, and yogic traditions understood something about prana. I'm not saying that Freud has the same insights as those systems. Of course, they're very different. But the idea is actually a really important part of our history. And if we only have a language for feeling that is a thought to be reasoned with, that anything that doesn't resolve through some kind of positive thinking or some kind of thought-based intervention is a malfunction, is something to correct rather than to be with, understand, make room for, let move, quote-unquote, process. That's the approach that's going to lead to more suppression, most likely. And it doesn't have to mean that someone's doing something wrong or they're avoidant. It's just how can we work with this stuff if we don't have some kind of scaffolding to understand it? And if we don't have an understanding that these psychological processes have some force to them, some energetic quality, and that they operate on some principle like that, even if it's metaphorical. If you're interested in this kind of material, I encourage you to check out my recent interview with Dr. Leslie Ellis. We talk about embodied dream work, nightmares, and trauma, and specifically about this places where nightmares get stuck. I'm also going to link the article that I cited in the video below in the description. And I'll link a book called From Freud to Jung, which talks about the movement of theory, psychoanalytic theory, that Jung had. Basically, some of the developments that he contributed while citing Freud's approach. So just really kind of comparing and distinguishing the two. Lastly, I just want to say, hey, if there's a topic that you are interested in commentary on, and really any of the field of psychology, consciousness, welcome to leave something in the comments and let me know what you're interested in. And I'll consider making a video and talking about it. I'm definitely not an expert in everything because no one can be an expert in everything, but I am opinionated, and I'm sure you'll see that.